Texas, October 1945. The girl was 11 years old and weighed 63 pounds. She stood in the processing line at Camp Swift, hands clasped behind her back like a soldier, chin raised despite the trembling. An American sergeant placed something wrapped in brown paper on the table before her. She stared at it, uncomprehending. "Chocolate," he said in broken German. She had heard the word, but never seen the thing itself. Her fingers moved toward it, stopped, moved again. Outside, the autumn sun blazed across a landscape so vast it felt like falling. The war had been over for 5 months, but its aftermath still moved in waves across the Atlantic, carrying human cargo in directions no one had anticipated. Ships arrived weekly at American ports, bearing displaced persons, refugees, prisoners, the sordid and catalogued remnants of a world that had torn itself apart. Among them were children, some orphaned, some separated, some categorized as prisoners of war, despite ages that suggested playground rather than battlefield. Liesel Hartmann was one of these improbable prisoners. She had been born in Hamburg in 1934, the second daughter of a civil engineer and a school teacher. Her childhood had been measured in air raid sirens and ration cards, blackout curtains, and the slow disappearance of familiar faces. Her father had been conscripted in 1942, sent east, and had not returned. Her mother had died in the firestorm that consumed Hamburg in July 1943, one of 42,000 souls who became smoke and ash in 3 days of incendiary bombing that turned a city into hell on earth. Liesel and her older sister Marguerite had survived in a bomb shelter, emerging to find their neighborhood erased, their apartment building a skeleton of blackened stone. Their mother's body never recovered because there were too many dead to count, too many remains to separate, too much death to document. What followed was a blur of institutions and authorities. The sisters were placed in a state facility for orphan children, a converted military barracks where hundreds of displaced young lives waited for relatives who might claim them, or for bureaucracy to assign them somewhere else. They stayed there through the winter of 1943, through 1944, through the spring of 1945, when the British arrived and everything changed again. In the chaos of Germany's collapse, as armies swept through and administrations dissolved and record-keeping became impossible, the sisters were somehow classified as auxiliary personnel, a bureaucratic category that encompassed anyone who had been tangentially involved with military operations. The facility they lived in had once housed communications workers. That was enough. On paper, they became prisoners of war, subject to relocation under Allied authority. Marguerite was 13 when they were shipped to England, then to America. Liesel was 10. Neither understood what was happening, only that they were being moved again, loaded onto trucks, then ships, then trains, always with armed guards and translation difficulties, and the steady erosion of anything resembling normal life. They arrived at Camp Swift in central Texas on October 3, 1945, part of a transport of 62 German civilians classified as low-risk detainees awaiting final disposition. The camp had been built to house thousands of prisoners during the war, its barracks and fences and guard towers designed for captured enemy soldiers. Now, in the war's aftermath, it served as a temporary holding facility for people no one quite knew what to do with displaced persons too. German to be welcomed, but too civilian to be truly dangerous. The landscape was alien to children raised in the gray dampness of northern Germany. Texas in October was still blazing hot, the sky impossibly large, the horizon stretching in all directions without the interruption of mountains or forests or the close-pressed buildings of European cities. The air smelled of dust and distant mesquite, and at night the stars were so numerous they seemed like a mistake, like something had torn open the sky and let through too much light. Liesel's first days at Camp Swift were spent in a fog of exhaustion and disorientation. She and Marguerite were housed in a barracks designated for female detainees, a long wooden structure with rows of cots and thin mattresses and windows that let in heat and light without discrimination. There were other women there, other girls, some German, some Austrian, some from countries Liesel had never heard of, all caught in the same administrative limbo. The camp routine was established quickly. Morning roll call at 6. Breakfast in the mess hall at 7. Work assignments or educational sessions during the day. Dinner at 6. Lights out at 9. The Americans ran the camp with military efficiency, but without the cruelty Liesel had been conditioned to expect. Guards were present, but not oppressive. Rules existed, but weren't enforced with violence. It was strange, this absence of brutality, strange enough to make her constantly vigilant, waiting for the facade to crack. Food was the most shocking difference. In Germany, for as long as Liesel could remember, food had been scarce, rationed, reduced to the mathematics of survival. Bread that was more sawdust than wheat. Potatoes that were more rot than vegetable. Soup that was more water than anything else. They had eaten to stay alive, not to be satisfied, and hunger had become such a constant companion that its presence was simply the baseline of existence. At Camp Swift, the mess hall served meals that seemed impossible. Eggs, bacon, toast with butter, beans and rice, chicken, beef stew. Portions that were not weighed to the gram, but scooped with generosity. The first time Liesel stood in the serving line, she stared at her tray with the kind of confusion that comes from seeing something that contradicts your understanding of reality. She ate slowly, waiting for nausea, for her shrunken stomach to rebel. Marguerite watched her with anxious eyes, both of them afraid this abundance might be a trick, a test, something that would be taken away or punished. But the food stayed down, and the next meal came, and the one after that, and gradually their bodies began the slow process of remembering what nutrition felt like. The American soldiers who ran the camp were a mixed group some kind, some indifferent, some clearly uncomfortable with guarding children and old women. Sergeant William Bill Henderson was one of the kind ones. He was 24 years old, from a small town in Iowa, and had spent the war in supply logistics rather than combat. He spoke no German, but had learned a few necessary phrases through repetition and necessity. He noticed Liesel because she reminded him of his youngest sister back home, same age, same serious expression, same way of watching everything with eyes that absorbed too much. He made it his unofficial business to ensure the children in the camp received adequate care, which mostly meant navigating bureaucracy to secure proper clothing sizes, arranging for basic medical attention, and occasionally bending rules about recreation time. It was Henderson who brought the chocolate. October 15th, 1945, 2 weeks after Liesel's arrival. The morning was clear and hot, temperature already climbing toward 90 by 10 o'clock. Liesel had been assigned to help sort donated clothing in one of the supply warehouses, a task that kept her in shade and required no particular skill beyond separating sizes. She worked alongside other girls, creating neat piles of shirts and pants and dresses, finding the occasional treasure a garment that was whole, clean, still useful. Henderson entered the warehouse mid-morning, carrying a wooden crate stamped with U.S. Army Supply Corps markings. He set it down near where Liesel was working and called out to the supervisor, asking something in English that involved gestures in the universal language of bureaucracy. The supervisor nodded, marked something on a clipboard, and Henderson began unpacking the crate. Inside were supplies for the camp store, a small facility where detainees could purchase basic items using the limited currency they were provided: soap, toothpaste, writing paper, and candy. Specifically, Hershey's chocolate bars, dozens of them, wrapped in brown paper with their distinctive maroon and silver labels. Liesel watched from the corner of her eye, continuing to fold a pair of trousers that were too large for anyone she'd seen in camp. Chocolate. She knew the word from before the war, from her mother's stories about celebrations and holidays, and times when such luxuries were possible. She had a vague memory of seeing it once in a shop window when she was very small, but whether that memory was real or constructed from descriptions, she couldn't say. Henderson noticed her watching. He paused in his unpacking, pulled out one of the bars, and walked over to where she stood. "Here," he said, holding it out. "For you." Liesel stared at his outstretched hand. The chocolate bar sat in his palm like an artifact from another civilization. She didn't move. Henderson tried his broken German. "For dich, Schokolade." Good. Still, she didn't reach for it. Years of institutional life had taught her that gifts came with expectations, that nothing was freely given, that accepting something meant owing something in return. Her hands stayed at her sides, fingers curled into the fabric of her dress. Henderson crouched down to her eye level, his expression softening. He was not a particularly articulate man, but he had enough human decency to recognize fear when he saw it. He set the chocolate bar on the table beside her, took a step back, and said the only German phrase he knew that seemed appropriate. "Geschenk," gift, no problem. Then he returned to unpacking his crate, giving her space to decide. Liesel stared at the chocolate bar for a full minute. The other girls in the warehouse had stopped working, watching this small drama unfold. Margaret, sorting clothes near the back wall, took a half step forward, then stopped, recognizing that this was something her sister needed to navigate alone. Slowly, as if the chocolate might vanish if she moved too quickly, Liesel reached out and picked up the bar. It was lighter than she expected, the paper wrapping smooth under her fingertips. She turned it over, examining it, reading the English words she couldn't understand, seeing the illustration of a cocoa bean that was her only clue to the contents. Henderson glanced over, caught her eye, and smiled. "Open it," he said, making unwrapping gestures with his hands. Liesel carefully peeled back the paper. Inside was a block of brown substance divided into rectangular sections. The smell hit her immediately sweet, rich, utterly foreign. Her mouth responded automatically, producing saliva in anticipation of something her body recognized as food, even if her mind had no reference for it. She broke off one small square, following the perforations in the bar, held it up to the light streaming through the warehouse windows, studied it as if it might contain hidden information. "Eat," Henderson encouraged. "Essen. Good." Liesel placed the square in her mouth. What happened next was a revolution of the senses, a complete recalibration of what food could be. The chocolate melted on her tongue, releasing flavors that had no analog in her experience. Sweet, yes, but not like sugar or honey, richer, darker, more complex. Smooth in texture, coating her mouth with a sensation that was almost overwhelming in its luxuriousness. Her eyes widened, her breath caught. For 5 years, she had eaten only to survive. Food had been fuel, nothing more tasteless calories that kept the body functioning. But this was something else entirely. This was pleasure. This was indulgence. This was the physical manifestation of a world where people could make something purely for the joy of consuming it. Tears filled her eyes without warning. She tried to stop them, embarrassed, confused by her own reaction. But the tears came anyway, spilling down her cheeks while she stood there with chocolate melting in her mouth and a kind of grief-joy shock mixing in her chest until she couldn't separate the emotions, couldn't understand what she was feeling except that it was too much, far too much. Marguerite was beside her in an instant, arms around her shoulders, murmuring reassurances in German. The other girls gathered closer, forming an unconscious protective circle. Henderson straightened up, alarmed, clearly worried he'd somehow caused harm. "She's okay?" He asked the room in general, looking to the older girls for translation. One of them, a 17-year-old named Katrin who spoke some English, nodded. "She is okay. Just ... surprised. Emotional. This is first time for chocolate." Henderson's expression shifted through several emotions in quick succession: surprise, disbelief, and finally a kind of horrified sadness as he processed what that meant. First time. This 11-year-old girl had gone her entire life without tasting chocolate. What kind of childhood was that? What kind of world had she survived? He pulled several more bars from the crate and brought them over, setting them on the table. For all of you, he said, gesturing to include the whole group. Share. Enjoy. You're just kids. Kids should have candy. The girls descended on the chocolate with a mixture of reverence and hunger. They broke off pieces, passed them around, tasted them with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for religious rituals. Some reacted like Liesel, overwhelmed by the sensory experience. Others ate quickly, afraid the opportunity would vanish. A few saved pieces in their pockets for later, hoarding impulses too ingrained to overcome immediately. Liesel ate her chocolate square slowly, letting it melt completely before breaking off another piece. She ate 4 squares total, then carefully folded the remaining bar back into its wrapper and tucked it into the pocket of her dress. Marguerite watched her with understanding eyes, the instinct to save, to ration, to make precious things last as long as possible. That evening, in the barracks after dinner, Liesel shared her remaining chocolate with her sister. They sat on Liesel's cot in the fading light, breaking off tiny pieces and eating them with ceremonial slowness. Other girls watched with envy and respect, recognizing both the generosity of sharing and the bond between the sisters that made such sharing automatic. What did it taste like? Marguerite asked, though she had tasted it herself. Liesel considered the question seriously. Like the world could be good again. Like maybe there are things worth surviving for. Marguerite was quiet for a moment, then nodded. Yes, exactly like that. The chocolate incident became a turning point for Liesel, though not in any dramatic or obvious way. It was more like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known existed, opening a door to the possibility that life might contain experiences beyond mere survival. It was a small thing, ridiculously small when measured against the enormities they had endured, a candy bar given by a kind stranger in a prisoner camp thousands of miles from home. But small things have weight when you've been living in deprivation. Small kindnesses become enormous when cruelty has been the norm. And the taste of chocolate, for a child who had forgotten that pleasure existed, was enough to begin the slow process of remembering how to be human in ways that transcended mere biological function. Sergeant Henderson continued his unofficial guardianship of the camp's children. He brought more chocolate when he could, distributing it through proper channels at the camp store, but also occasionally slipping extras to the youngest detainees. He arranged for a shipment of books in German, convincing supply officers that educational materials were important for morale. He advocated for better heating in the barracks as winter approached, pointing out that children acclimated to northern Germany would struggle with Texas's cold snaps. He wasn't alone in these efforts. Other soldiers, seeing the children, began to soften the rigid military structure of the camp. A corporal from New Jersey organized a makeshift school, teaching basic English to those who wanted to learn. A private who had been a carpenter back home built better furniture for the barracks chairs that didn't wobble, tables at proper heights for children. A lieutenant with medical training conducted health assessments and ensured proper nutrition for those recovering from years of wartime scarcity. These small acts of care were, in many ways, more effective at dismantling the ideological architecture of the regime than any propaganda could have been. The girls at Camp Swift had been taught that Americans were enemies, cultural degenerates, threats to everything civilized and good. But American soldiers were bringing them chocolate and books and warmth, treating them with a casual humanity that contradicted everything they'd been told. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Liesel began attending the English classes. At first, it was simply something to do, a way to fill hours that might otherwise be spent dwelling on loss. But language became a bridge to understanding, each new word a small act of connection to the country that held her captive, but also fed her, sheltered her, kept her alive. She learned Thank you. Please. Good morning. My name is Liesel. She learned. Chocolate. Book. Warm. Friend. She learned that American soldiers played something called baseball in the fields beyond the camp, and that they would sometimes invite the older boys among the detainees to join them. She learned that there was a thing called Thanksgiving coming, and the camp would serve a special meal with turkey and pie. She learned that Texas had more sky than seemed physically possible, and that sunset turned that sky color she had no German words to describe. By November, the camp had settled into something approaching routine. The initial chaos of processing had given way to established procedures. Legal authorities were working through the complexities of classifying detainees who needed to be repatriated, who qualified for refugee status, who had relatives in America or elsewhere who might sponsor them. It was slow work, tangled in red tape and international agreements, and the simple difficulty of confirming identities when so much documentation had been destroyed. For the children like Liesel and Marguerite, this meant waiting. Weeks became months. The Texas autumn gave way to winter, which was mild compared to Hamburg, but still cold enough to require the extra blankets Henderson had procured. Christmas approached, a holiday that had lost meaning during the war years, but began to reassert itself in small ways. Decorations appearing in the mess hall, carols in English that some of the girls learned phonetically, a general softening of the camp's atmosphere. On Christmas Eve, 1945, the camp held what the Americans called a special program. The mess hall was decorated with paper chains and crude ornaments made in craft sessions. Tables had been pushed aside to create open space. A small pine tree stood in one corner, strung with popcorn and topped with a star made from tin foil. The detainees were invited to attend, though attendance was optional. Most came, drawn by curiosity or the promise of special food, or simply the human need for ritual and community. They filed in, German civilians of all ages, and sat on benches arranged in rows facing a makeshift stage. What followed was a program of music and skits performed by American soldiers, some talented, some decidedly not, all earnest in their attempts to create something joyful. They sang carols. They performed an abbreviated version of a nativity play with improvised costumes. They told jokes that didn't translate well, but were funny anyway because of the soldiers' commitment to the performance. And then, at the end, Santa Claus appeared. He was actually Corporal Davis from Mississippi, wearing a borrowed red suit and a cotton beard, carrying a large sack over his shoulder. He moved through the hall, distributing small gifts, candy canes, small toys, bars of chocolate. When he reached Liesel, he crouched down and pulled out a cloth doll, handmade, with yellow yarn hair and a stitched smile. "Merry Christmas, little one," he said through the beard, his accent thick and warm. Liesel took the doll with trembling hands. She had owned a doll once, before the war, before the firestorm, before everything. It had been lost with everything else, another small casualty among millions. This new doll was nothing like that old one, but it was something, a small soft thing to hold in the darkness, proof that somewhere in this strange new world, people still made objects meant purely to comfort children. She pressed the doll to her chest and felt something inside her crack, open not breaking, but opening like ice beginning to thaw. Tears came again, but different from the chocolate tears, softer somehow, mixed with something that might have been gratitude or might have been grief for all the lost years when no one gave her dolls. When survival had been the only gift available, Marguerite reached over and squeezed her hand. Around them, other children clutched their small gifts, faces reflecting the same complex mixture of emotions. The hall was full of these moments, small private reckonings with kindness, individual confrontations with the possibility of hope. After the program, they returned to the barracks. Liesel placed her doll on the shelf beside her cot, positioning it carefully so it seemed to be sitting upright, watching over the space. She fell asleep with her hand touching its yarn hair, grounding herself in the physical reality of something given freely, something that asked nothing in return except perhaps the chance to be received. The months that followed brought slow progress through the administrative machinery determining their futures. Liesel and Marguerite were eventually classified as displaced persons eligible for resettlement. Their father was confirmed dead, their mother's death documented despite the absence of remains, their status as orphans established beyond bureaucratic doubt. A German-American family in Minnesota, distant relatives whose connection was traced through patient genealogical work, agreed to sponsor them. Papers were filed. Approvals were obtained. Transportation was arranged. By April 1946, the sisters were being prepared for release from Camp Swift and relocation to a small town outside Minneapolis, where people they never met were preparing to become their family. The day before their departure, Sergeant Henderson found them in the mess hall during lunch. He sat down across from them, his usual easy smile tinged with something more serious. "I hear you're leaving tomorrow," he said through Katrin, who had become the unofficial translator for important conversations. Liesel nodded. "Yes, to Minnesota. To family." Henderson reached into his pocket and pulled out a Hershey's bar. He set it on the table between them, then placed two more beside it. "For the journey," he explained, "and for after. To remember." Liesel stared at the chocolate bars, these objects that had become symbols of something larger than themselves. Proof that the world contained sweetness, that strangers could be kind, that survival might eventually transform into something approaching living. "Thank you," she said in careful English. "For chocolate. For everything." Henderson's eyes got slightly damp, which he tried to hide by adjusting his cap. "You're welcome, kid. You both are. I hope... I hope Minnesota is good to you. I hope you get to be kids again. Real kids, not just survivors." Katrin translated, though something in the emotion needed no translation. Marguerite spoke for both of them. "We will remember this place, not as prison, but as the place where people were kind, where we learned that maybe the world has more good than we had been taught." Henderson nodded, stood, and offered a somewhat formal salute that was more respect than military protocol. Then he left, returning to his duties, to the ongoing work of managing a camp full of people whose lives had been interrupted by history and were now trying to find their way back to something normal. That night, Liesel lay in her cot with her doll tucked under one arm and the chocolate bars hidden under her pillow. She thought about Hamburg, about her mother, about all the years of hunger and fear and loss. She thought about Texas, about impossibly large skies and sergeants who gave candy to children they'd been taught to consider enemies. She thought about Minnesota, about whatever waited there, about the future that was suddenly possible in ways it hadn't been before. The chocolate, she decided, she would save. Not forever. She was learning that hoarding against future scarcity was a survival mechanism she could begin to release, but for specific moments. One bar she would eat on the train to Minnesota, marking the journey with sweetness. One she would share with the family who was taking them in, an offering and a bridge. The last she would keep for some future moment when she needed to remember this truth, that kindness existed, that pleasure was possible, that the world could surprise you with goodness when you'd learned to expect only pain. They left Camp Swift on April 12, 1946, boarding a bus that would take them to a train station, beginning the journey north to their new lives. As the camp disappeared behind them, Liesel pressed her face to the window and watched the Texas landscape roll past endless sky distant, horizons mesquite and dust, and the strange beauty of a place that had been prison and sanctuary both. Henderson had come to see them off, along with several other soldiers and camp workers who had become familiar presences over the months. They waved as the bus pulled away. These American men who had chosen kindness when other choices were available, who had seen children in need and responded with chocolate and dolls and warmth. The journey to Minnesota took 3 days. They traveled by bus and train, crossing a country so vast It redefined Liesel's understanding of scale. They saw plains that stretched to infinity. They saw mountains that put the Alps to shame. They saw cities and towns and endless miles of space between them. America, they discovered, was a country built on the principle of more land, more sky, more possibility than seemed reasonable. On the train, somewhere in Iowa, Liesel opened the first chocolate bar. She shared it with Marguerite, breaking off squares and eating them slowly, savoring both the taste and the memory of how it had felt to taste chocolate for the first time. The sweetness was familiar now, expected, but no less wonderful for being known. A woman sitting across from them watched with curious eyes. She was American, middle-aged, traveling to visit grandchildren in Chicago. She asked, through gestures and simple words, if they were immigrants. Marguerite nodded, explained in broken English about Germany, about the camp, about going to new family. The woman listened, then reached into her purse and pulled out a small package of cookies, which she offered with a gentle smile. "Welcome to America," she said. "I hope you find happiness here." It was a small gesture, meaningless in the grand sweep of history, but meaningful in the particular moment of two girls on a train trying to believe in futures. They accepted the cookies with thanks, learning that kindness wasn't unique to Camp Swift, that perhaps this strange new country had generosity woven into its fabric in ways their homeland had forgotten. They arrived in Minnesota on a cool spring evening, met at the station by the Schneider family Heinrich, and Rosa and their 3 children, relatives so distant that connection required consultation with genealogical charts, but relatives nonetheless. They came with open arms and prepared rooms, and the kind of nervous hospitality that comes from genuinely wanting to do right by children you've never met. Liesel presented them with the second chocolate bar that first evening, an offering that seemed inadequate, but was all she had to give. Rosa Schneider accepted it with tears in her eyes, understanding somehow the weight of the gift, the history it carried, the bridge it represented. "Thank you," she said in German, her dialect different from Liesel's, but comprehensible. "And welcome. Welcome home." Home. The word was strange, displaced, uncertain. But standing in this kitchen in Minnesota, with chocolate being shared around the table and strangers who were trying to become family, Liesel felt something shift inside her, some small beginning of belief that home might be possible again, that the word might eventually mean something other than loss. The years that followed brought their own challenges. Learning English fluently, adapting to American schools, processing trauma that surfaced in nightmares and sudden panics, navigating the complicated feelings about being German in America so soon after the war, carrying a heritage that was both identity and burden. But there was also healing. There were good days that outnumbered bad ones. There was school and friends, and eventually college. There was the slow rebuilding of a life that had been shattered into pieces and was now being reassembled into a new shape, different from what it would have been, but valuable in its own right. Liesel never forgot the chocolate. She kept the last bar for 7 years, preserved in wax paper in the back of her drawer, taking it out occasionally to remind herself of the moment in a warehouse when a sergeant had offered kindness to a child who had forgotten kindness existed. Eventually, the chocolate went stale and inedible, but she kept it anyway as artifact and symbol proof that the thing had been real, that the transformation had happened, that she had indeed been that girl who cried at the taste of sweetness. In 1962, when she was 27 years old, married, pregnant with her first child, Liesel finally threw away the petrified chocolate bar. But before she did, she sat with it one last time, remembering. She remembered Hamburg. She remembered Camp Swift. She remembered Henderson as awkward, German, and the way Texas sky looked at sunset, and the feeling of chocolate melting on her tongue for the first time. She remembered learning that the world could surprise you with goodness, that enemies could become protectors, that sweetness was possible even in bitter times, that small acts of kindness carried weight beyond their physical form. These were the gifts the chocolate had brought, and they lasted far longer than any candy bar ever could. Her daughter, when she was born 3 months later, grew up in a house where chocolate was plentiful, unremarkable, just another snack in a well-stocked pantry. She grew up without ever knowing hunger, without ever experiencing deprivation, without ever having to learn that food could be both scarce and sacred. And that, Liesel understood, was perhaps the greatest gift of all, that her child could take chocolate for granted, could eat it without tears, could exist in a world where sweetness was assumed rather than miraculous. That was what survival had won, what endurance had purchased, what kindness had made possible. Years later, decades later, near the end of her life, Liesel would tell her grandchildren about the war, about Camp Swift, about the sergeant who gave chocolate to a girl who had never tasted it. She would describe the warehouse, the brown paper wrapper, the moment of transformation when flavor became feeling and sweetness became hope. It was just candy, she would say, just a chocolate bar. But it taught me something I needed to know, that the world still had good in it, that people could still choose kindness, that even in the aftermath of everything terrible, there was still room for something sweet, and her grandchildren eating their own chocolate, in a world their grandmother's generation had rebuilt from ruins, would listen and try to understand how something so simple could mean so much, how a taste could change a life, how kindness could transform the shape of the future. The chocolate was gone. The sergeant was gone. Camp Swift itself was eventually decommissioned and converted to other uses. But what they had created together, that moment of connection across language and nation and ideology that remained encoded in memory, passed down through story, becoming part of the larger narrative about how people survived the unsurvivable and learned to live again. In the end, that was what the chocolate represented. Not just sweetness, but the possibility of sweetness. Not just pleasure, but the return of the capacity for pleasure. Not just a gift, but proof that gifts were still possible, that generosity hadn't been completely consumed by war, that somewhere in the wreckage of the 20th century's greatest catastrophe, there were still people who would offer candy to a child, expecting nothing in return, except perhaps the chance to remind themselves that they were still capable of kindness. It was a small thing, ridiculously small. A chocolate bar in a Texas prisoner camp in October 1945. But small things matter. Sometimes they matter most of all. And sometimes a little girl tastes chocolate for the first time and learns that survival might eventually become something more than just not dying, might eventually become the foundation for a life that contains sweetness and joy and the quiet revolutionary act of believing in tomorrow.